Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 639. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today joined by Dave DeCamp. Dave, how you doing?
I'm good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back.
Happy to have you back here today, Dave. And boy, has it been an eventful week. And I thought, a great way to cap it off would be to have you on and to talk to you a little bit about everything going on kind of in the U.S. And then as I feel like in the past week, we've gotten a lot clearer on what's going to happen in the November election. And because of that, who is going to be surrounding Trump has become incredibly important. So I want to talk about a lot of that on today's show. Just a reminder to people before we jump into it, we are holding our summer fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. If you can, head on over and make a contribution. Dave, let's get into it. The first one I have here, you wrote on July 17th, Republican hawks want Mike Pompeo and Tom Cotton in Trump's cabinet. And so, you know what, Dave, let me start here. Just ask you this question first. Does it seem to you that we are likely going to have another Trump administration?
Yeah, I would say so. Especially the news today. I mean, there's a big report in Axios that Biden might drop out. I mean, especially, and the assassination attempt has just supercharged Trump. I thought it was pretty clear that we were going to get another Trump term before that, and now it's just really solidified that. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I expect, unless the Democrats come up with some great candidate, which I don't really see happening. Yeah, I think, we're probably going to see another Trump administration.
Okay, so here is maybe the good news about another Trump administration, Dave. I'm going to present this as charitably as possible. That Trump really learned a lesson that the CIA and the FBI and the all the alphabet agencies are really working against him and the American First agenda. And he also understands that personnel is policy. And as much as he might want to end the war in Ukraine and might point at an official and say, you right there, you end the war in Ukraine. If that person is not loyal to him, then the war in Ukraine will not end. And so we saw J.D. Vance picked as the vice president. So what kind of signal, let's start with J.D. Vance, what kind of signal do you think it says that J.D. Vance was picked? Is this a signal that Trump learned his lesson, that the deep state is really his enemies and that the war state is the fuel that feeds them?
Well, I hope that that's the lesson, but this is only the first pick for now. I think we're really going to find that out if he's elected and then when he's forming the cabinet. I think Vance, though, is a good signal for the war in Ukraine because, Vance has kind of made that his thing since he came into the Senate. He's been one of the leading critics of the proxy war. And when you hear him talk about it, you could tell that he knows about it, that he's serious about his opposition. Now, we could get into the areas where he's bad on, like Iran and China later. But, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, he said in an interview with the New York Times last month that he thinks the U.S. they should freeze the lines where they are and work out a deal where Ukraine is neutral, but also independent. He did say that the U.S. should provide some sort of military assistance to Ukraine in the future. But, for the most part, what he says about Ukraine is good. Trump's been kind of hard to nail down about Ukraine, but he has said recently, he said during the debate, that he would end it, work out a deal. And I think that is a real strong possibility that could happen. But again, it does matter who he appoints in other positions because the vice president isn't the one who would be negotiating that, in most cases, unless they give him some special tasks. But it is going to really matter who his Secretary of State is, his National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense. And that story you mentioned, a lot of the hawks in the Republican Party, like the real hawk, the ultra hawks, are not happy with Vance because of his stance on Ukraine, and they want Trump to balance it out with Pompeo, Tom Cotton, and all these just horrible people who are bad on everything, Ukraine, China, Israel, just all across the board.
Yeah, absolutely there, Dave. And it does seem that, this may be where we really figure out what Trump has figured out over the past 8 years. If you look at particularly the last two vice presidents, Kamala Harris and Mike Pence, they really haven't done anything. I mean, Harris has, made a couple statements and had a couple foreign trips. Pence the same thing, but it's not as if they say have more influence in the administration than Secretary of State Antony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, or John Bolton. It seems like that's really where a lot of power has centralized in recent years. Now, have you read anything about who Trump might want in this position, or is this just what we're hearing that the establishment wants, and we really don't have any insights onto who Trump may be considering for these roles?
I haven't seen any reporting like that. There might have been some, but I haven't seen that.
All right. So, Dave, let's talk about China here, because there's this really interesting tweet that I think got a lot of attention, and a lot of people don't read past the tweet anymore, and so they kind of miss the real story. But didn't you hear, Dave? Trump is going to be a dove on China, or at least, he doesn't want to go to war with China, and says Taiwan needs to defend itself, or something along those lines. So, what did Trump really say, and does it signal any kind of shift in Trump's very hawkish China policy?
Yeah, so I mean, really, what he said is that Taiwan's got to pay. He said they stole the U.S.'s entire chip industry. They don't give us anything, so they got to pay. And he said the U.S. it's like an insurance policy. The U.S. is like an insurance company, talking about the U.S., I guess, commitment to defend Taiwan. And he said this when he was asked, would you defend Taiwan? Because as we've talked about on this show a lot, the official U.S. policy towards Taiwan is not, the U.S. is not officially committed to intervening, say, if China attacks Taiwan. And American leaders usually would not say one way or another what they would do. They call the policy strategic ambiguity. Biden has broken from that, pledging several times that the U.S. would defend Taiwan. So that, I think, is why it's going to be a question that Trump might hear when foreign policy is discussed. So when he was asked that, he kind of went on one of his tangents, and he said, look, I think they just got to pay us, so he didn't say, no, we won't defend Taiwan. He also didn't explicitly say yes, but he said, again, the wording he used, saying it's like an insurance policy, basically saying like, yeah, but we should get something out of it. And that's kind of been his thing. That's his line on NATO. I wish Trump thought the things that some people think he did, because you'll see, like, during the debate, Biden says Trump wants to get out of NATO, and Trump will kind of like smile and shrug, not really deny what he said. But when you hear Trump actually talk about it, he's not saying that the U.S. should leave NATO. He's saying they got to pay their fair share. That was something he tried to do with Germany. He was going to pull some troops out of there and tried to make McGregor the ambassador, but that never happened. And that is his attitude with, he wanted South Korea to pay more, Japan to pay more. So it seems like it's kind of just that's what it is. It's not necessarily that he's a dove on China all of a sudden. Although he does say things like, me and Xi were best friends before COVID. I got along with him really well. But if you look at the policy he oversaw, he's still saying his trade war was great, and that's why Biden's continued the tariffs and increased the tariffs. But he oversaw a period of very, increasing tensions between the U.S. and China, and building up the U.S. military around there and all these alliances in Asia. So I haven't seen any indication that that's going to change. And I think he's going to be surrounded with China hawks, because even the people that are good on Ukraine, like J.D. Vance, are China hawks. So I think I don't think there's really a way around that. Like, there's any, we're not expecting Rand Paul to be Secretary of State or something.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Dave. I will say the Biden administration has seemed so unable to engage in any diplomacy. It seems almost absurd to say, but even if, as long as you don't end up with Secretary of State Tom Cotton and Mike Pompeo as the Secretary of Defense. So let's say we avert the worst case scenario and Trump puts some more establishment votes in those positions. It's almost hard to imagine diplomacy with China getting any worse. The level of disrespect that the people in the Biden administration feel the need to show to the Chinese on a daily basis is unbelievable. Every time a U.S. official goes to Beijing, they had to say something highly insensitive and offensive to the Chinese. And maybe Donald Trump would, maybe his art of the deal kind of style negotiation would be a little bit better on this. And certainly you have seen small rashes of negotiations under the Trump administration, such as what was happening with North Korea. Maybe that's a real lesson that, hey, if you have somebody like John Bolton around you, they could really mess up one of the greatest things you could have done as president. This isn't to be too positive towards Trump or anything like that, more just a real indication of how poor the Biden administration has been.
Yeah, I mean, I remember during the transition period, I couldn't imagine a worse Secretary of State than Mike Pompeo. I mean, but then then Blinken came in, and I mean, it's a different style, but they really are kind of the same way. Like they believe the same things, and Mike Pompeo's more kind of bombastic about it and more in your face about it, and Blinken just is kind of more of a liberal, but it's really essentially the same thing that he does. And it is incredible to see him go to China and lecture them about their trade relationship with Russia or something. Like they think that's going to do anything. So one thing I did see Trump say in that Bloomberg interview that sounded a little good was him saying kind of that he doesn't like sanctions, that the U.S. needs to kind of rethink sanctions, saying it's pushed China and Russia together. The Trump administration was very sanction happy. The sanctions all the time. They were the ones that really started sanctioning China in like a meaningful way. And sanctioning certain sectors of their business. And that again was really ramped up by Biden. So if he's rethinking that, hopefully that's something, he is actually seriously considering. With Trump, it's tough to really know because he says so much stuff. I was kind of dreading, having to start covering this election because it's like, with Trump, it's just so, it's like, when is he being genuine? But I figure now is the time we should really start covering this stuff, the foreign policy angle of this election. But It's tough to really know what's going to happen. Again, I would have more hope, more positivity toward his China policy based on some things that he was saying, if I didn't realize that China hawks are going to be in no matter what.
Yeah, no, that is a real concern, Dave, because I think there's a lot of people in Washington who are truly China hawks and believe that's the reason that we need to continue the proxy war in Ukraine. It has nothing to do actually with Russia. It's just weakening Russia in order to weaken China. And while that has absolutely backfired and certainly empowered Beijing, but probably Moscow as well, it seems like Trump could very easily get sucked into that narrative and just continue the proxy war in Ukraine for that reason. Now, I guess anything else on anything with the RNC convention, Trump, down that lines, what you think his potential foreign policy could look like. We really didn't discuss Israel. I think everybody knows that Trump has at least positioned himself as being worse on the situation by Gaza than Biden. Have you seen anything to suggest that the case is otherwise?
No, and Vance has also positioned himself as very pro-Israel, and was talking about, that interview he did with Sean Hannity saying, if you're going to punch Iran, you got to punch them hard. You can't go on these little bombing runs, referring to Biden's bombing of Iraq and Syria, and, defending, saying Trump killing Soleimani was so great. So that's concerning, because Vance, he's voted to leave Syria. He's talked about getting troops out of Iraq. But ultimately, if you're pro-Israel and, you're bad on Iran, you're not going to get the U.S. out of the Middle East. That's just the reality. So the one thing that both of them say is that they have to finish. They have to finish the job. They have to wrap this thing up, which might sound good, but you realize what they're saying is, Vance said that Biden's been micromanaging Israel. essentially what they're saying is they'll give Israel whatever it wants to do, to finish the job, which that could mean just full on, ethnic cleansing of Gaza, taking it over. I wouldn't even be surprised if Trump or if Kushner's back in the mix, if they just try to bribe Egypt into taking the Palestinians, say, we'll give you another $1 billion in military aid each year or something.
Or
You know, I,
Congo or Rwanda or any of these African nations. It doesn't even have to be Egypt, probably. Just whoever
yeah,
take the money.
yeah, same thing. The UAE, Saudi Arabia say, so you take these Palestinians, we'll make it worth your while. I wouldn't be surprised if that's some sort of deal that they come up with, especially
Yeah.
if Kushner's in the mix. Kushner has said that he would not be in the next administration, but I mean, I'm sure he's going to be involved in some way.
Yeah, I would assume he would. And with Trump, I would guess that your official title is less important than in a typical administration. Or even if you don't have an official title, it's just the amount of face time you get to spend with the president and what he will consult you on is what you have more influence over. Where with Biden, I think Andy Blinken, he takes over the State Department. He essentially sets up a little fiefdom over there and is able to do whatever he wants, as far as internationally. He just kind of tells Biden, I think, a lot of what the policy is. Although I did read a report very recently that said, while Biden prefers to delegate on most issues, foreign policy is the one thing he remains active, engaged, and inquisitive about. And so, it's really crazy that we have this demented president. And the one thing he may actually be cognitively doing is backing the worst thing that we are doing, which is the genocide going on in Gaza. So I guess the only other thing I will say, and this is kind of the one reason I would endorse a Trump presidency, Dave, is because I think the liberals would actually be upset about what's going on in Gaza if Donald Trump were president right now and we're overseeing this ethnic cleansing. I certainly think it would be much harder to talk about deporting all the college students that are protesting in favor of the Palestinians and calling them all anti-Semitic. And so I don't know. Do you have that same hope that I do, that the liberals might suddenly become really good on the Israel situation and Trump becomes president?
Yeah, I think probably, but they wouldn't have any influence over it. So now, I mean, the really unfortunate thing about everything that's been going on with the election stuff is that pressure that was on Biden from within the Democratic Party seems to have like just gone away. Now they're freaking out about who's going to be the candidate. And then this thing with the assassination, I mean, just nobody's attention seems to be on Gaza right now. So, I mean, yeah, like the network, news might cover Gaza more and be more critical of it. And there'd probably be a lot more protests. But ultimately, that's not going to matter to Trump, especially the fact that he can't do another term. This is going to be it.
I'll agree with you some. On the other hand, I will say it felt like, especially in 2020, liberal outrage was really driving a lot of policies. At first, when Trump wasn't taking COVID seriously enough, they really pushed him on that, and the country ended up in complete lockdowns. And then after, George Floyd happened, suddenly everybody was allowed to go out in the streets and protest with no concern about COVID whatsoever. And, I do. It does feel like the winds have changed, particularly with the graze of a bullet of Trump's ear, as far as if this country is in just a more culturally liberal or conservative direction. But at least during the previous Trump presidency, while he was in the White House, it did seem the country, remained like the liberals had a huge influence over the culture and the direction the country was headed still. That may return. It may not. And, they may not even be good on that issue anyways.
Yeah, that's true. And I do think kind of long term, uh, Israel's support in the U.S. is going to wane quite a bit. But that's one of the reasons why I think Trump is saying you got to finish the job. He wants it to be done with quickly, even if it means slaughtering a couple million Palestinians.
Right. You remember, I think earlier in the war, he said his issue really wasn't with what was happening in Gaza, but the pictures coming out of Gaza that were really upsetting him. Basically, this looks really bad for Israel that you're doing these horrible things. Not, I'm appalled that Israel is doing these horrible things. Now, Dave, I guess let me ask you a very broad question to start, and we could drill down to the details here a little bit more. But what do you think the chances are that let's say by the November election first, and then January, of course, when Trump would take office, that this conflict in Gaza is still going on?
I think the chances are pretty high. I mean, it's what's going on right now is really something like the fact that it's Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and Smotrich basically blocking a deal with Hamas. I mean, you've had the defense minister, the head of Mossad, all say that a deal's possible. Even Gallant said the entire security establishment is on board with the idea, but it's Netanyahu blocking it and making all these demands. Um, to sabotage the negotiations. That's what he's purposefully doing. It's all over Israeli media. You still have the U.S. claiming that it's Hamas. You got to put pressure on Hamas. But that's just the situation right now. So how long can Netanyahu go, hold on doing this? I don't know, but he's definitely going to make it till next week, which is his big trip to D.C. He's hoping that he's going to get this big warm welcome and secure more American support, and then that might give him some points in domestic politics in Israel. And then he's going to try to hold on till November. But I mean, it's just a matter of, if he can hold on and keep going. And then things might change. There might be a reason why the military says, all right, we don't need a deal. And this is temporary. This is a temporary ceasefire. The big concession that Hamas has made, based on my reading of all these reports about it, is that Israel doesn't have to commit to a permanent ceasefire. And then there's some language in there that makes it Hamas happy that, the negotiators will pressure Israel to keep negotiating until there's a permanent ceasefire. But that seems like that's the big concession. And that was the big issue, big sticking point. But now Netanyahu's raised all these other demands on issues that they already settled. So they're thinking, they want to give the military a break and get some hostages out because they know that's the only way to free them, and then probably eventually restart military operations in Gaza.
I mean, that all just sounds like such bad news, Dave. I do think that Netanyahu is probably one of the people who understands American politics best on the planet. And I'm really concerned that he understands that the political dynamics of the United States at this point means that this is the hot time for debate topics to be going on. And the debate in Washington is between supporting Biden, or Biden's support for Israel, which is 99.999% unconditional, and then Trump's 110% support for Israel, which is we're going to give Israel everything they want, and then 10% more so they can knock the hell out of whoever they want and do whatever they want. And I mean, if you're in Tel Aviv, that seems like a pretty good debate to be going on in Washington, that level of support. And so I'm very concerned that Netanyahu sees every benefit in the world to continue to drag this out. I guess, more point to the question here. Do you see any of this negotiation going on by Tel Aviv as actually an attempt to reach a ceasefire, or is this all just kind of for show to make sure that to appease Biden and people within the United States who are upset that this hasn't come to an end yet?
I don't think it's for show, just because you've seen everybody, saying that they want this deal. And one thing that one of the negotiators said was that I told Netanyahu, that we could restart it after the initial ceasefire. And there's been a lot of protests and everything. And it seems like there's just so much pressure on Netanyahu for his October 7th, failings, and just in general, the fact that over 9 months later, there's still hostages there. And many of them are dying in Gaza. So I think it is genuine that the military, they want to break. And one of the reasons why is because they want to get ready for war in Lebanon, apparently. And I think that they would, they've even said this, that they would escalate in Lebanon if there was a ceasefire in Gaza, just to keep the nation at war. I think that is something that they want to do.
Yeah, Dave, it was pretty interesting this week. There is a story that I covered that Israel said they're running low on tank shells. And the only reason they admitted it, of course, is because they didn't want to deploy the female soldiers to Gaza, which, is interesting from the perspective of the Israeli chauvinism, but also from the perspective of the female Israeli soldiers that are jealous that they can't get on the bloodletting with their male counterparts. So, I had a couple more things I want to ask you here, but I want to go to this because this is one of the things that people ask me maybe the most, Dave, which is what is the true death toll in Gaza? We saw this study out from the Lancet a few weeks ago, and I think it was a little bit misstated by people saying that the Lancet concluded that 180,000 Palestinians had been killed. But what is your take on the death toll? Do you think that 38,000 number is accurate, an undercount? And what do you think of the Lancet number?
I think the 38,000 number is probably an undercount. But the Lancet number, so there's a few things because the number from the health ministry in Gaza appears to be the number of Palestinians killed, by Israeli missiles and tank shells and all that. And if that number doesn't include, which I don't think it does, the indirect deaths of starvation, disease, things like that, then that could be another few thousand, tens of thousand. There's also the 10,000 people they say that are missing under the rubble. So I think it could be somewhere around 50, 60,000. The Lancet, 186,000. They did that. This was talking about indirect deaths that haven't. Not all of them have happened already. They said in the coming months and years. It was worded not that well, that letter that they published. So I get why people thought that they were saying 186,000 people have died already. But they said it was a conservative estimate using the number of indirect deaths in other conflicts. And when we talk about indirect deaths, that's people that died due to things like starvation, lack of medicine, lack of access to proper health care. And when you talk about Gaza, I mean, it's the worst case of that in any war of this century, it seems like. Maybe Yemen was up there with Gaza, but Gaza's so small and densely populated that if there is indirect, the indirect deaths are probably going to be really high. So I think that number is definitely plausible. And in the long term, it could even be higher than that. It's just tough to really know. I can't figure out the scale of people that have starved to death, died of disease, or other things. I did my first interview on my show with the Palestinian Khalil Sayegh, Palestinian Christian from Gaza, and his dad died of a heart attack or a health reason while he was sheltering at the Catholic Church in Gaza while it was under Israeli siege. And they said, he was healthy. If he could have gotten to a hospital, he probably would have lived, but he didn't, and he died. So, and then he had a sister who died maybe of heat exhaustion when she was walking to the border of Egypt. He doesn't even really know how she died. He just knows she died, and his mom ended up in a coma on the way to Egypt. So that's just one guy with two family members who have had these kind of indirect deaths. So I think that number could, is reasonable. But again, when we're talking about, months and years, but it's just so hard to say that I don't really want to say anything definitively like what I think.
Yeah. And there's so much there too, Dave, because if you look at it, it is just about a page and a half paper. It's not some kind of in-depth study. They used the 37,000 number at the time. And I think me and you would both agree that, as you said, the number of direct deaths from the conflict could be anywhere between 50 and 60,000. There was a report recently in 972 magazine that talked to six Israeli soldiers who just talked about, they would open fire on a house when they were bored. They would essentially have just areas where they would kill people who crossed lines that they didn't even know existed, looking for food or other kinds of aid. And they would just leave the bodies there to rot, to let the dogs or wild animals at them, and only buried them in, it sounds like kind of shallow mass graves when aid convoys came around, only so the international press or any international aid groups would be able to document it. And so, if the horrors really are that there's 60,000 people dead total or something like that. Well, then the Lancet study is really underestimating because they're only looking at the baseline at 38,000 dead.
Mm.
The pretty significant difference in numbers there as far as how many you would estimate to be the excess death toll. So, this whole thing, David, is just really, really horrific. There's some bad things that go on in other places in the world. I've seen some horrible scenes come out of Burkina Faso or Mali or Niger where, jihadists on motorbikes will ride into a town and just commit absolute atrocities. At the same time, the Israeli soldiers are doing a version of that in Gaza. You covered one story on your podcast earlier this week, maybe, about this 24-year-old young Palestinian with Down syndrome who the Israelis allowed to be torn apart by a dog. And do you want to get into a few details? I mean, just this is the level of cruelty that's hard to comprehend.
Yeah, I mean, this is the account from his mother. She said that they were in their house and Israeli soldiers kind of came in to raid the place, and the dogs ran in and mauled the child, and that they put him in another room. Well, he wasn't a child. He was 24 years old, and apparently he had severe Down syndrome, so he was like a child. And he was, they put him in another room and claimed that they were, going to give him care. And a doctor came in and she said, he heard his screams this whole time. And then the doctor went in and then he stopped screaming and the doctor left. So she assumed that they gave him a sedative, and then he ended up just dying. And then they had to leave, and they came back and they found him there, with maggots in him because they just left him. So yeah, I mean, that does go to show the cruelty here. And you mentioned, that they shoot Palestinians who enter these like red zones that they call them. There was a video released by Al Jazeera of two Palestinians walking along the beach, no weapons, shot dead by Israeli soldiers, and then the bulldozers came and just buried them under the sand. So yeah, they don't get counted, So there's a lot of reasons to think that the death toll is very high.
Dave, it's just incredible that what our politicians would call the most moral army in the world would not only sicken a tat dog on an innocent Palestinian family, but the idea that he died in that room means they didn't even really make an effort to try to provide him with medical care. Maybe they gave a sedative to knock him out, but that just allowed him to bleed out on the floor. I mean, just, all the horrors of what's going on in Gaza, truly just awful. And, that's why your work at antiwar.com is so important. I think you, maybe more than anybody else, just covering this day in and day out, all the Israeli war crimes, is such important work, Dave. And, we really appreciate it, and you coming on the show here today. So everybody, at DeCamp Dave on Twitter, and new Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp is the show. The video version of the show is worth watching. If you're somebody who drives to work and listens to your podcast, then you're not missing anything with the audio only, but the production quality is pretty good. It's definitely worth watching. And then you are the news editor at antiwar.com. And so the top part of that website every single day is mostly Dave's articles, maybe a few of mine and Jason Ditz and Connor Friedman sprinkled in here or there.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I appreciate all that, and thanks for covering me while I was on vacation. You did a ton of writing then.
Yeah, well, I feel qualified to say, Dave, you are one of the hardest working men in the independent media, because myself and a crew of others try to cover for you for a couple weeks, and for a day or two, it's manageable. But once you're on like the day number 10 or 11 of writing 5 to 6 articles a day, I gotta say it is a little bit taxing.
Yeah. Well, you guys did a great job, and it really made me realize, like, while I was in Australia, I didn't really follow the news that closely, but I just checked antiwar.com whenever you guys would post the page, and like, it is such a great resource to follow the foreign policy news. Sometimes I think like we're not keeping up enough because a lot of people just scroll social media, but you don't have time to sit there and scroll social media all day. So we just have a nice roundup of all the top foreign policy stories and all the great opinion pieces. So it's definitely a great site. And we've also been getting a lot of help from you guys at the Libertarian Institute with the stories you write. So that's a reason why people should support the Libertarian Institute as well.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Kyle.